directed, just so our moderator can be sure to pose it to the correct presenter. And also, please send in your questions as we go instead of waiting until the end. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll receive a webinar evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback so we can continually improve the SSP webinar series. You'll also receive a link via email to the recorded broadcast of the webinar and to the slides. Our co-moderators today are Elizabeth Demers, Senior Acquisitions Editor for History and American Studies at Johns Hopkins University Press, and Tom Beyer, Director of Platform Services at PubFactory. They've put together a great panel to discuss how packaging and use trends affect the ways in which publishers and librarians acquire as well as manage knowledge. It's now my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Elizabeth so she can introduce our panel and get us underway.
Good morning. Our first presenter, Vivian Berghahn, is Managing Director and Journals Editorial Director at Berghahn Books. In addition to overseeing the Journals Division at Berghahn, her managerial responsibilities include advancing the company's online initiatives and the strategic development of its overall publishing program. Next up, we'll have Wendy Queen, who is the Director of Project Muse. She serves on the International Board of Counter, AUP Digital Committee, and the Crossref Book Interest Group. Hopkins Press and Project Muse were recently awarded a Mellon Grant to pursue the distribution of open access monographs. She holds an MA from the University of Baltimore in Publication Design, Information Arts and Technology. Finally, recipient of the 2012 Frederick G. Kilger Award for Research in Library Technology, our third presenter, Sayeed Choudhury, is the Associate Dean for Research Data Management at the Sheridan Libraries of Johns Hopkins University, Senior Presidential Fellow at the Council on Library and Information Resources, Principal Investigator for the Data Conservancy, and a member of the ICPSR Council and Duraspace Board. Welcome, presenters. And now, Vivian Berghahn.
Hi everyone, thank you, good morning, and thank you for joining all of you. I'm here sort of with my other panelists who will be focusing sort of on the platform technology user approach to offer a publisher's perspective. So for us, sort of not only speaking from an acquisitions consideration, but also sort of summarizing what is for us now a recent, current, and future exercise that we're undertaking at Berghahn Books as we prepare to launch our own platform. So many of the functionality elements that we're discussing today are very much at the front of our mind, and for us right now we're trying to decide how best to undergo and prepare and to plan and to launch such a platform. So just to tell you a little bit about who we are, just to give you some context for the content and the scale. We are an independent scholarly press. We're based in Brooklyn as well as Oxford. We're in the humanities and social sciences, so with respect to the types of components that one has access to, they're sort of somewhat limited, but yet there's definitely still some opportunities. We're doing around 150 new titles a year, have a little under 40 journals, and then therefore a backlist of about 2,000 titles. We currently do have a range of online platform offerings. We have our journals, which range from being in-house ourselves until it became very unscalable, at which point we went to Ingenta and are now launched just recently with PubFactory. It's that launch that now also sort of set the stage for some of the considerations for the sort of new ebook world we're thinking about. On the ebook side, we did some in-house chapter level very, very early on, but otherwise are just doing a far more traditional array of various ebook vendors in the library and retail markets, some open access with Knowledge Unlatched, Wellcome Trust, and now again looking to the future. And so that future are our ambitions for our own online platform, and that really is sort of trying to then think how to marry together our journal holdings as well as our ebook holdings, given the overlap that we have across our subjects, series, areas, and anything else that we have that we feel really complements one another and can really be taken to the next level. So on the one hand, we're thinking packages, and on the other hand, we're thinking components. And we're ultimately drawing a lot on the experiences we had from our journals platform, where I think journals, as we all know, have sort of led the way with online and the sort of more container approach to content offerings. So now we're in the midst of planning for our platform and what that means for us in terms of how we need to be thinking about design, logistics, and then how we then sell and market those opportunities. And then finally, sort of last but not least, one of the topics, sort of how that impacts then how we would be acquiring content. So the first thing we did as we sort of prepared is we ran a range of analytics, and this is just giving you sort of a very basic overview of we look to see sort of, okay, how are people using our websites, how are they finding us, and then how are they using it. And we thought this would then inform the way we wanted to think about the user design, and essentially the mantra that the landing page is now your new homepage. And, you know, sort of the graph at the bottom is a very traditional sort of symptomatic of what's going on in the industry, of seeing sort of the entry points on the table of contents page versus the abstract page. Of course, this is where all the marketing is happening. It's really pushing to the abstract page, but with all of that data and knowledge in hand, how do we then think about how these container pages are designed and presented and ultimately used? So essentially, this then starts with the user interface. So how are we then presenting what we had? I mean, the analytics we ran, so obviously there are a range of channel analytics we took to see especially what users did once they got to the platform that were quite informative and somewhat surprising in terms of where people went on the website once they got to the main page. So sort of really in that respect, sort of looking ahead to see how user behavior will inform how we plan to design the page, and especially how we think about the different platforms and wanting to parallel user experiences. Ultimately then, what is the call to action? What will the page look like? What do we want them to see when they first arrive? And where do we want them to go next? Are we interested in them discovering further components, or do we really want to now sell them on the whole? And it could vary on the topic, it could vary on the title, it could really, so these are the sorts of questions we really have begun to sort of ask ourselves as we're thinking about sort of informing the design for our interface. Next is then sort of for us a big issue of production logistics. So we have around 1,200 ebooks across the various vendors, and we would love to put these all up on our new platform, but that means a whole range of considerations we now have to have with respect to metadata. We need abstracts for all of these chapters. We need to create chapter level metadata. The main key consideration is the taxonomy we want to be using. And then finally assigning DOIs. So it means we probably need to start small and then think about how we want to build up our packages and sort of what approach we want to take. So really a sort of a very practical, how many hours in the day and how many, you know, how realistic is it for us to really launch within a certain timeline, and therefore sort of how would we build up and start with our various offerings. And then tied into that, the question is, what then is for us the pipeline for how we handle various elements? Curation is one. I mean, I think there is this move towards having a range of components, so how do we want to handle those from a production perspective? How do we tie that into the production pipeline for the print book? How are we communicating those different elements? How are we communicating also to other ebook vendors? What is the version of record? So these are sort of all these sorts of logistics that we find ourselves grappling with as we need to sort of really come up with a kind of best practices plan as we plan ahead. And then finally, once we have this content all arranged, presented as we wish it to be presented, and we have the range of content up there in its various packages, how do we then go ahead and what are we exactly offering? Are we then focusing on packages? Are we looking at the pay-per-view option of really going down? So what is the sort of the range of scales that we have? And then, you know, will we have sample content? So how will we sort of really also, above all, tie what we're offering to maybe print packages, or sort of come back to sort of our more traditional offerings? So sort of how will we go about pricing? How will we go about adding on as we increase our holdings? And so sort of a range of considerations that we now have across these various components that have now become far more diversified. So for us, it's really been a matter of how are we organizing and how are we then communicating what it is that we now have on this wonderful platform. And then really the opportunities there, we're really pulling from our experiences with our journal platform, because again, as I said earlier, I think this is where journals offer some really great models for how to think about the power of components and the power of pieces. But for us, it's really been less about selling the actual content and more about content awareness, author awareness, research awareness, driving traffic. And so I think in this respect, we see the smaller scale of the component side as a really super opportunity for us to be promoting the larger content and the sort of the books, the lists, the subjects, the series. And so in that respect, we're quite excited to really be able to use a platform that allows us through social media to send out chapter samples that we can turn off, on and off for free, the kinds of things that a complete book we couldn't do. So in this respect, I think a sort of more smaller scale approach to the content allows us to just have more exciting ways to be accessing. And the other is then also enabling our authors, empowering them with tools such as Kudos to really also use social media or other marketing channels to promote their own content and to really involve them in the process and to really sort of engage them. Contributors are also very key here. And really just, it's just another great example of ways that we can work with them in a very visible way. And again, the opportunities are because at a chapter level you have far more range to present and to show and to provide samples. And then finally is commissioning considerations. So I put this sort of at the end in terms of acquisitions and how does this impact how we think about the content we're bringing on and the books we're commissioning and sort of our acquisition strategies. Right now, our platform planning and our container approach has very much been driven by the back end. We have this content, what can we do with it in the most effective way using the technology that's out there? But then, of course, obviously, that takes us to the next step of how then can we build on all of this and what will that change about how we publish our books? Will it change what we acquire? I mean, the question is ultimately, what are we containing? Are we a publisher of books and journals, or are we a publisher of components? Do we now have more opportunities, for instance, for collections? I mean, we've long been a publisher who've continued to publish collections even when other publishers have held back. And I do think that the more component container approach offers really exciting opportunities for collections. Monographs potentially as well, but ironically perhaps less so, but we'll see. I mean, we're still sort of grappling with that as we do still have a very strong monograph list. So, but then again, other considerations, there are now less opportunities presumably for republished content, which has already been a waning area, but still, there is still room for the odd reader. But what does this mean given that so much is now so easily available in the component form that it came from originally? So this is really an area that we probably saw to be the most impacted, if it's not already. I mean, it's already. So the other area that for us we felt most excited about is really the value add for our authors. It's as basic as putting color in images that they currently don't have printed, but it's also the ability to have more images, multimedia, and ways to sort of augment the text and really provide these additional add-ons in ways that we couldn't otherwise do. Again, we're social sciences, humanities publishers, which I mentioned earlier, because I think that's really important to demonstrate the fact that we don't have the range of graphs and data sets and additional materials that maybe the more sciences have, where a lot of this comes from. But at the same time, there are very exciting opportunities that have otherwise been restricted previously, largely because of costs and the margins. So really, it's in terms of how then do we think about these elements. So SEO, for instance. Do we need to, as much as we think about titles now, do we need to start thinking about chapter titles more than we already are? Are they now taking on a life of their own? Do we need to think about how they stand on their own versus as a whole? And it was an area that I have to say we hadn't really started thinking about until also thinking about this panel. And I think for us, we really felt that nothing on the acquisitions side changes. These are books that still need to stand on their own. The chapters need to stand on their own, and they still need to stand up to scholarly scrutiny in the same way we would expect even if we were selling them in the traditional ways or making them available to librarians in the traditional ways. What we have are exciting opportunities to really build on the content as it is now. And above all, in that respect, curation becomes key, because I think one of the challenges is therefore, and we have this now with authors who provide, because we can offer now image galleries, then send us 100 images on a CD, of which 10 are probably good enough to use, and the other 20 are slight reiterations. So I think for us, curation remains key. And now this sort of now just takes on a different level. Curation, whether it's the book as a whole or whether it's these additional components we want to be adding. And I think for us it's really this question of just because there is the possibility for more doesn't mean there should be more. I think the need that there is, if anything, more and more of a need of refinement. So we need to be thinking about what we're commissioning, what we're including, and then how we're organizing it. How is it found? Is it relevant? And I think for us this remains this key mantra that we need to come back to. Does it remain relevant for our audience, for our authors? And sort of keeping that in mind, that even though the technology is there to allow for a range of other opportunities, to sort of keep coming back to sort of remind ourselves that curation still remains key. And as a publisher, that's our role. Our role is this curation. We're not aggregators of content, of components. We are publishers ultimately of high-level scholarly works with a range of opportunities to be added on. And thank you.
Hi, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'll start with a little background. Project Muse is a nonprofit collaboration between libraries and publishers, an online database of peer-reviewed academic journals and books. We provide access to digital humanities and social science content from over 250 university presses and scholarly societies around the world. Currently, our holdings include over 400,000 journal articles and 1 million chapters. Muse was a journals-only platform for about 15 years, and we expanded to include monographs in 2012. An important note for today's conversation is that we have plans to expand the platform to include reference works and primary source materials. Sorry about that. I'm grateful that in July we were awarded Muse Open, a grant from the Mellon Foundation to support the development and a distribution channel for open access monographs through the Muse platform. This really affords Muse many opportunities. We're able to reinvent the reader experience of monographs, moving away from PDF, which is our current content type for monographs, to HTML. This format will be more digestible and usable and have the flexibility to create more content containers and content connections. The new reading experience will be part of a larger redesign that includes more personalization and recommendation services. As more OA content provides us with many opportunities to look at these services in a different way, the redesign also includes much emphasis on accessibility and how we can help our publishers produce content in the most accessible way. We're in the process of determining business models to support OA monographs, all of this while ensuring we are meeting our publishers' needs and remain fiscally responsible. The program is scheduled to launch in the summer of 2018. At that point, I hope we have a combination of OA content that includes books from the NEH program as well as newly conceived books that take advantage of being digital or perhaps born digital. So today I broke my presentation and the conversation into 3 categories: containers for selling, frames for content, and containers for distribution. These 3 areas weave in and out of each other, which means at one point in the future the distinction should become artificial. I'll start with selling. Muse sells globally to over 2,500 institutions, about half of which are international. Most of our sales are collections, but in the books world, single titles are increasingly rising in preference. So when you think about containers for selling, you have the traditional forms that are current, and I think of them as very broad. So you have your collections, your discipline packages, your individual books and journals or subsections of those, articles, chapters, or even custom packages like PDA or EBA. And what I find interesting about the flavors of PDA is that some are hand-curated and some are programmatically selected, while others are user-driven, and there are many different nuances in between the different programs. But it's somewhat indicative of the world we live in, and we're trying to determine the right containers for selling and curating in this landscape. And in the granular world, theoretically, you can think of any chunk of content as a container: paragraphs, media, abstracts, and images. These types are granular containers. But with any container that we're talking about, either broad, traditional, granular, all of them require standards and IDs to really work towards relating in an interoperable way. And currently, I should say for Muse, we're still selling in very traditional ways, but we are moving quickly towards more granular solutions. And for granular, at this point, we're really only at the article and chapter level. We haven't gone deeper than that. And as a side note, there are many challenges in our landscape managing and communicating such large amounts of options. And when you start thinking about new containers for selling that can be made of many granular pieces, perhaps even across publishers, the landscape becomes even more complicated. Yet, I do find it intriguing, and we keep thinking of ways OA can alleviate some of these challenges. So, containers as frames for content. Muse takes a format-neutral approach to building the platform to ensure we're prepared for a future where content and containers are more interoperable. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll expand the platform to include references and primary source materials. The frames and containers are more flexible form than a traditional article or chapters. Users may at times look for a specific book or journal, but more often they search for an answer, and we always hope to throw in a bit of serendipitous discovery in there. And they may also be looking for just a broad understanding of a topic. Broadly, one could consider a frame, a chapter, article, a reference entry, but combinations of these pieces of those traditional forms create a more curated, custom experience. We've been looking at data around when are the abstracts accessed, are there times that image galleries are used beyond the written content, and we need to know way more in this area before we can even start developing even, I think, simple use cases. And, I believe this allows users, when we think about presenting content in different containers and in different frames, to experience digital and analog content on a spectrum rather than in these unbridgeable silos or these independent containers. Users are increasingly expecting an open and accessible environment. They expect to be able to mix and match chunks of content and create effortlessly something of their own. This curated content container is dependent on interoperability and tools. So in the world of our aggregation, broadly speaking, I'm finding that we need two approaches to create new containers for the content. So the first one, as Vivian mentioned, curation keeps coming back throughout all of my discussions about containers. We'll move away from it for a while, and then we'll find ourselves right back at that curated level. And so an approach that we've been discussing and experimenting with at Muse is something called hubs of authority, where we can have a person, a curator, create a new work, so a new type of work, a new container that discusses and collects content from various sources on the platform. Currently we're using an instance of Commons on WordPress, but we're moving forward to including it as part of the primary platform to eliminate a silo. Basically the usage has not been tremendous, but I feel firm that when we incorporate it onto the platform and incorporate it into the primary corpus of content, that we'll see an increase in this. The second approach is using data to best determine what users have found useful and create a custom set or container of content. This falls very much in the personalization and recommendation category. This is not an easy undertaking, and Muse has had to expand their staff to include a business analyst and then in the future a user outreach person to support this strategic initiative. With new approaches to what is the container or frame for content, there are challenges for publishers, aggregators, and how to support this from a distribution, financial, usability, and preservation perspective. And it really does require us to reinvent many of our businesses and our approach to them. So containers for distribution. Today I find that the methods of distribution are still most often traditional and mimic the containers for selling. As I said, Muse, we are still and aggressively exploring granular sales of the article and chapter and learn what does it mean to have OA content on the platform. We currently have some OA content on the platform, but we don't have enough data about how it's used to make any real conclusions, and we haven't made as many content connections as we want to and need to. So by opening up access to the content and data, it makes it possible for end users to discover and experience content within and across digital platforms. And for all of us, the goal is and always to develop opportunities and environments that encourage a broader use of our content and new ways to experience that content. So in closing, I will say, I think the most interesting and most promising way to look at new containers is to think in terms of linked data. In my opinion, it is a more holistic way for connections and containers to form. And with that said, I will pass the conversation to Sayeed Choudhury.
Thanks, Wendy. I'm hoping everyone can see the screen here. I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak at this webinar. And one qualifying comment I need to make at the beginning. If you're an expert in linked data, I think you're going to find my comments very simplified. So I apologize in advance for that. I'm trying to describe it in the most accessible way to the most diverse audience that we might have. So with that in mind, just a quick, very high-level overview of linked data. It is a concept of the semantic web, which has actually been discussed by Tim Berners-Lee since the beginning of the web. It's a concept that's been around for over 20 years. And at the heart of it is this idea of containers. And very broadly speaking, containers are really just aggregations of similar objects. And similar is an interesting term that we can discuss at length. but that's fundamentally what it's about. In order to support use of linked data, you need URIs instead of URLs, so this is fundamentally about persistent identifiers. Using standard HTTP as the protocol to resolve those identifiers or connect and interpret these different identifiers. And then the language of the semantic web is RDF, or the Resource Description Framework, which is built on this concept of triples. And a triple is basically made up of a subject, a predicate, and an object. An example of that is this phrase right here: this data set is member of this data collection. Is member of doesn't seem like natural language, of course, but that's the kind of predicates that exist in these RDF triples. And that's mainly so that machines can actually interpret the triples in a way that's consistent and accessible. But I'd mentioned that the semantic web concept has been around for over 20 years, so if it's really as simple as using URIs and building these triples, then why don't we have more content in linked data formats? So the real challenge actually is the creation of data models. This is basically a model of the resources, the fundamental resources that you're trying to describe, and the relationships between those resources, and to the extent possible, starting to try and infer the semantics, as the term implies, of those resources and those connections. And if you think about a phrase like "too hot to handle," that phrase can literally mean, you know, a frying pan on your stove that is too hot to handle, or it can be a metaphor for a very tense or sort of contentious conversation. So a computer doesn't necessarily know the difference between those two phrases, even though a person hears that in context, they can probably figure it out very quickly. So if you think about that kind of interpretive layer and the data models that ultimately will get us to that point, you can see the complexity that's involved in terms of the kind of machine actionable way of using data. This slide basically shows an image from a paper that you see the reference at the bottom of the slide, describing what's called the Open Archives Initiative Object Reuse and Exchange, or OAI-ORE. This was developed by multiple individuals, but it's fair to say led by Herbert von Sompel and Carl Lagozzi, who also developed the OAI-PMH, which is the protocol for metadata harvesting. And both of them basically saw this as the evolution of the Open Archives Initiative, whereas the protocol for metadata harvesting was about discovery at the collection level. ORE is an attempt to basically move into this linked data context and stop thinking, as Herbert likes to say, in a repository-centric way and rather a resource-centric way. So rather than thinking about repositories or even platforms of content, you start to think about the resource itself as being the center, and you build all these connections around those different kind of web resources. And broadly speaking, what this diagram is showing on the right side is this concept of an aggregation. So this thing labeled A-1 you could think of as a container, and all the things that it's pointing to are the elements of those containers. And then on the left is this thing called a resource map, or a REN, which is a collection of these aggregations. That's, at the fundamental level, those are the two most important concepts of ORE. Now, ORE has been discussed a great deal in many circles, and some people will argue that it is very complex, it's overspecified, and it's difficult to implement. Again, that's something we can debate, but one of the things that we've done recently through a project called OurMap, which was funded by the Sloan Foundation and involves the Data Conservancy, which I lead, and Portico and IEEE, is to provide a lighter weight, or maybe even simplified approach to ORE-like aggregations through these three concepts. One is what we call the Distributed Scholarly Compound Object, or DISCO for short. And this is basically just our proposed protocol for describing aggregations. And then a set of APIs that allow you to create, query, and retrieve these so-called DISCOs. If you are familiar with RDF, you probably know about Sparkle endpoints, which are not necessarily easy to build and maintain and support. These set of OurMap APIs are our attempt to provide that kind of functionality, not the complete set of functionality, but similar functionality in a much lighter way. And OurMap is also identifier agnostic. So one thing I would say, for example, was DOIs get mentioned a great deal, and DOIs, to use a triple, is member of persistent identifiers. But there are many persistent identifiers, some of which are not supported through what I would call broad community support to an organization like Crossref or DataCite, but rather a particular community. There are many scientific communities that have their own identifier schemes. In some cases, they may simply not know about DOIs or other kinds of identifiers, but in some cases, they actually have very good reasons for it, because their identifiers provide a level of granularity and resolution at that level of granularity that a DOI might not. And this is something that I'll come back to when I'm talking about containers that include software as well. So with this OurMap project, we did some work recently with the Center for Open Science and the SHARE project from the Association of Research Libraries. So a great deal of content from the SHARE network is being housed within the so-called Open Science framework that the Center for Open Science has built. And we were able to get access to a subset of that SHARE data and then map the OurMap protocols and APIs onto that to generate these graphs. This is an example of the kind of information graph that we've been generating. And during a recent event in a hackathon in mid-July, we actually ended up getting access to all of the SHARE data and being able to infer a data model. We were not given an explicit model by SHARE or by COS, but we were able to infer a data model and make these kinds of linked data graphs for all of the SHARE network. And with this kind of information, we can start to do things and ask questions such as, where are there interesting connections between these different institutional repositories within research libraries? Are there researchers working together with each other that an individual institution may not even know? Because an individual institution may look at their IR or institution repository and say, well, here's our network. But their authors may and do publish in lots of journals. So by making these information graphs, for example, from not only SHARE, but from IEEE, one of the partners of OurMap, you can start to make additional connections that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do by looking at it in this one particular institutional lens. So we think this is a really useful way to start thinking about the whole network of institutional repositories, the gaps that might exist, places where the metadata may not be fully actionable, certainly from a machine perspective, and places where you might start to identify interesting collaborations or new research areas in a network manner rather than in an institutional manner. And I do not expect anyone to sift through this slide. The only reason I'm showing it to you is to prove that putting a data model together is no small task. This is, in fact, the data model that underlies the OurMap protocol. At its heart are three main concepts: agents, resources, and events. And we chose those basically because we are trying to think about things like data being cited in papers or software being used for particular kinds of data and so on. So a good part of this project, really most of the first year, was basically spent just putting this data model together and making sure that it was in fact conformant with RDF and with the W3C standards for linked data and so on. It is not as fully rich or expressive as a full-fledged ORE representation, but we believe that it's rich enough to start making those kinds of interesting connections and to do so in a way that if you need to, you can expand it later to something like ORE. So one project that we hope brings all of this together is what's called the Black Press Born Digital. There's a professor at Purdue named Kim Gallen in the history department. She has a visiting appointment at Hopkins, who's leading this effort. It builds upon what's called the Black Press Research Collective, and this is a group of researchers who have decided to look at African American newspapers, which are increasingly available in digital form, and really mine through them as a resource to understand not only African American history, but American history, sociology and anthropology and lots of other disciplines, because the newspapers really captured in a very unique way the story of the African American community in the United States. And this particular project is taking 4 authors, including Professor Gallen, are looking through these newspapers and writing 4 books, which will be published as monographs by the Johns Hopkins University Press and will be published as ebooks, we hope through Muse Open. But then we are also looking at what are the linked data kinds of possibilities that might represent a third type of I'll use in this context, container or linked data containers. So as an example, imagine that we have these books, and they of course contain lots of images, and say there are images of statues of some sort. And an individual is just walking on the street and sees the statue and takes a picture of it. In the not too distant future, you can imagine that this person will take that picture and tag it a certain way. And by doing so, they've actually just created a node on a linked data graph, the kind of graphs that I showed you for the share network, for example. And then that graph would connect to the content from the Black Press More Digital. So this is a fundamentally different form of discovery. It's not somebody typing in a set of terms into a web browser. It's not somebody going to a library catalog. It's somebody basically just in the real world, in an everyday context, some sort of seemingly random moment decides to take a picture or ask some sort of artificial intelligence like Alexa or Echo or Siri or Cortana, take your pick, about a topic. And then by entering a graph, you're suddenly connected to the set of other resources that are available on that graph. So you can imagine that those might be pathways into the books that are being published by the press, or in fact there may be pathways from the books out to these other forms of content if you decide to make those links bidirectional or so-called round trip them, as some people like to say. So we're using this project as an opportunity to explore what it might mean to look at books and ebooks as, quote, traditional containers, but are there other kinds of containers of content that we could link in a way that it becomes much more machine ready so that we can draw these kinds of connections in ways that we don't even recognize right now. Building upon this theme that Vivian and both Vivian and Wendy talked about, curation, can machines actually help you with the curation of containers and linked data? I think that's a really important question for us to think about in the future. Particularly because of certain developments of other kinds of containers. One that we've been using a great deal at my institution for the projects that we work on is called Docker containers. And this is just a description from docker.com website that describes this further. If you're familiar with virtual machines, which in some sense are a layer of abstraction away from physical servers where you are running one set of applications or software, virtual machines basically allow you to run multiple applications and multiple software platforms on the same physical device. Docker is in some sense the next step or instantiation of this kind of virtualization. A Docker container is not only like a virtual machine in that it allows you to do this kind of multiple application or computer setup. You can do it on any infrastructure. It doesn't have to be tied to a particular platform. That's very handy. So what you can imagine is in the future, containers are not only going to have content, they're going to have software associated with them. And imagine that I might have a container that not only has data, but it has a visualization tool bundled into it as well, so that when I access it, I don't only discover the content, I actually can visualize it using this tool. And to come back to that idea of persistent identifiers and granularity, in most cases, people are assigning DOIs to an entire data collection. But this visualization tool actually works on the individual data elements. So unless there's some kind of identifier for those individual elements, the visualization tool is not going to be able to access them. And accessing it to the entire collection may not make sense. So I think these are kind of important questions for us to think about as we move forward with linked data and this idea of containers. These are just some of the questions that we are examining as part of these projects in collaboration with the press. I don't have very firm or clear answers, quite frankly, but I think these are important things for us to consider in this context. And I do want to point to that last phrase that today people say if you're not on Google, you don't exist. I would submit that in the current times and certainly in the future, if you're not on a graph, then you won't exist. If you can't find a way to connect to the sort of serendipitous discovery that I described earlier, then people basically won't know that you exist. So I'll end with a few acknowledgments for our funders and certainly for Professor Gallen, who is leading the Black Press More Digital project, and then I think we can open it up for questions.
Great. Those were three really
excellent presentations. And the first question is for Wendy, and it's, how is Muse considering librarians' attitudes about user data as you contemplate personalization?
Okay, I will say, as an aggregator, we're always delicately balancing the needs and concerns of our three constituents: publishers, libraries, and end users. Our personalization services will be optional and can be somewhat anonymous. And the general feedback from libraries is that there's some services included in the personalization that are wanted, such as saved searches, virtual bookshelves, things like that. So we're really balancing how to provide specific custom services, but also respect the libraries' and users' concerns for privacy. But in some ways, the personalization is actually being pushed by many in our library community.
And I just want to throw it out to everyone. Do put your questions in the question panel, and we'll get to them as we can. And now a question for you, Vivian. One of the things that you mentioned was that you're still thinking of books as sort of relatively standalone objects, even as you add them into your platform and are looking at ways of chunking them up. Do you see that changing in time? Do you see that actually sort of changing what you're trying to acquire, or looking at books that live beyond sort of that initial publication?
Yeah, I mean, I think in many respects, I guess it depends on the long term. So can we keep bringing them back to life once the kind of initial purpose maybe has been found, and find ways to keep reviving them? And I think this is where, again, I feel like it's about sort of how the opportunities that are there to push and promote and to revive. I mean, I would say, again, this is where we pull from all of our experience on our journals platform, where, especially with social media, I mean, with current events, we can dig back into the backlist, make an article free and post it out there for everyone to access, tied to a very relevant moment. And that's really been a very important way of driving traffic to the site, driving journal awareness, author awareness, and I think this is sort of where, in many respects, maybe it allows us to extend and continue to sort of revive the chapter and the book in ways that maybe traditionally, because these are still pretty high-level monographs, may have been gathering dust on the library shelf, and whatever the digital version of that is on an ebook vendor site. So I think at this point we're still thinking very holistically. We're not getting to the point where, but with any collection or monograph, the chapters go through peer review and every single chapter is scrutinized and has to stand up to peer review scrutiny. That won't go away, and I don't envision us moving to a more disaggregated front-end approach. But again, I just think it allows us, we then potentially have more opportunity on the back end, and indeed to then provide. And I think just to speak to some of the issues that are raised, I think then above all, the logistics are key. So tagging, I mean, making this content tagged in a way that is relevant and can be found, I think is really important. And so that's sort of one of the areas that I think we're grappling with. Potentially on the front end, how is this content relevant? Potentially are we acquiring in certain areas, and maybe certain usage trends, particular interests in certain topics that we can see at a component chapter level may then inform areas we begin to acquire in. So I can definitely see how usage stats and trends really could then drive the direction of the list potentially. Although, given how long it takes a book to get out, that's not maybe the approach. But yeah, but I think at this point it's still very much how we can keep using and reviving content that remains relevant on the whole.
Yeah. And sort of following on from that, Sayeed,
what role does metadata play in a linked data environment, and you know, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I think in a fundamental sense, as we move forward with linked data, the distinction or boundary between metadata and data become blurred. And it may not even make sense to distinguish metadata from data. What do I mean by that? In the sense of, if you imagine subject headings, for example, as metadata, you can see this article is described by, take your pick, African American studies, you know, history, so on. So metadata in a linked data context is really just another node on a graph, and the distinction between those that are used to describe other nodes or our actual resources themselves, to some level, doesn't matter as much. And the other point I would make is that given the scale of the amount of data that we're producing in particular, we are going to have to rely on machines to start generating these metadata and make assertions about subjects, about connections, and so on. The level to which you wish to rely upon that assertion or believe that assertion is a choice. But I simply don't believe we have enough people, human resources to attach metadata to all the data that's being produced even today. And that will only get worse as time gets forward.
And following on from that, Wendy, one of the things you mentioned was the idea that you're thinking more in terms of frames and sort of being content agnostic. Do you see that as sort of the kinds of content that sort of becoming more alike, sort of the journal articles and books and the reference works and primary sources that you're talking about adding to the platform ending up sort of becoming more alike, or do you see a sort of a plethora of different kinds of frames that the platform needs to support?
I would say different kinds of frames, but I'll go out on a limb and say in the future, to the end user, will it matter that it is in a journal article or a book chapter? And so when I'm talking about taking a format neutral approach, I'm really talking about setting up the containers to respect the content regardless of its traditional format.
And also, Wendy, you discussed OA as a means by which researchers find other content. Is that a way for Muse to make and other publishers to make OA ultimately profitable?
Well, I think in the OA space, like I said earlier, it is an opportunity to see what can we do when we combine the gated and the open content, but also in the OA environment, will that traditional format be as important? When you think about the whole ecosystem in publishing, it exists in some ways. The way that libraries purchase content is the way that in an aggregation we kind of make those broader containers into collections that are only journals, that are only books, just from the purchasing aspect of it and how that currently works. So I do look at OA as an opportunity to kind of experiment in that area to see what does the combination of these traditional formats look like, what are the new containers that come out of that, because you aren't working with how the packages are being sold.
Right. Okay, and another question for Sayeed. And it's really, I think, to ask to expand upon the very last comment he made about searching for and discovering, and if you could just expand on that a bit in terms of what does it mean to be on the graph, and how are users going to go about their discovery in a linked data world?
Yeah, I can maybe expand upon that with a story actually that I shared at the Muse Publishers meeting earlier this year. I have an Amazon Echo in my home now. Alexa is the name by which this goes. I don't know if it's a he or she or what. And what I find amazing is that the amount of information that I used to look up on a web browser has transitioned to apps on my phone. And you can think of lots of examples about that. Directions, booking your flight, finding a restaurant, you name it. With Echo, it's even moving away from apps. I simply ask Alexa questions. And at this point, they may seem fairly simplistic. Things like the weather, the time, setting up a timer, you name it. But eventually, I think what will happen is that people will basically be inspired or prompted in real time to ask questions of these kinds of devices, and not just informational or sort of life organization questions, but research questions. I may be watching something and see a topic that I find interesting and basically ask, tell me all the resources that exist on this subject or this event or this person. And that these devices will basically start providing feedback directly and saying, here's the kinds of things that exist. The kinds of things that exist have to be on these graphs. Machines cannot make leaps of faith. They can only infer between connections on these graphs. So I believe that's going to be the way that a lot of discovery will take place, rather than sitting down at some place and using typed information into some sort of browser bar.
Yeah. And a question for you, Vivian. One of the things you talked about was the sort of opportunity of expanding the kinds of material that you're able to provide in terms of more images, more multimedia, and the necessity of curating that. And what I wanted to know was whether or not are your authors able to step up to that bar? Are they able to produce the multimedia assets that could be really of use online?
Well, it varies, and I think it means that we have outlets. We do have, when authors do have it, then often they have a very rich stable of any number of, whether it's interviews or videos, or we do a fair amount of visual media, anthropology, film. I mean, I think there is then the opportunity there. So it's definitely not to be forced on every author. I think it just means that when the opportunity is there, that we can really go with it and position ourselves. And I think also it means we would then have more opportunity to attract authors who then are, have more of that and are looking to have a publisher who will work with them more and offer those opportunities. And really, it varies. I mean, obviously getting the right format and everything is a challenge, even for many authors, just for images. But as I said, I mean, I think it really there would really, in our eyes, be key authors, key titles for whom this is very good, and then others where maybe, they do take on a more traditional format, but still the opportunity lies at a very basic chapter level, where, again, I think this allows us, and then to speak to something also, a point Wendy made, I think indeed researchers don't care if it's an article or chapter, they want it to be relevant. So for us it's really sort of bridging the gap and sort of combining and making content available across subjects and areas where the actual origin isn't so important as the content and the research that's inside of it.
Excellent. And with that, I think we're going to turn it back to Tim.
Okay, thank you, Tom. And thank you, Vivian, Wendy, and Sayeed for sharing your knowledge with us today. And thank you all for attending. Once again, please do take the time to respond to the webinar evaluation that you'll get in your email. Your feedback will help us to continually improve the webinar series. And please join us for the next SSP webinar on October 11th at 11 a.m. Eastern, Building Your Next Great Product, Iterative Product Development for High-Risk Projects, moderated by Jeff Lang, Assistant Director for Platform Development at the American Chemical Society. And with that, we are concluded. Enjoy the rest of your day.